In 1847, the very first metal flute was unveiled, but there was a huge problem in the way of its success. It was unfathomably expensive. Even 40 years later, in the 1890s, a professional sterling silver flute would cost as much as a year's wages for the average worker. That's like a sterling silver flute costing $100,000 in Australia, about 10x the starting price of some professional sterling silver flutes today. As such, manufacturers were eager to design a more affordable instrument to capture the growing market of beginner flute players. And yet, in their pursuit of a beginner flute, they would make a significant mistake. An error which turns every flute into a ticking time bomb, waiting to be irreparably destroyed. And this flaw is present on almost every single flute made today, from base beginner models to advanced models and even some professional models. The culprit? A chemical reaction caused by silver plating. This video is supported by me! If you'd like to learn more about my ceramic flutes, then check out the links in the description. When flutes were first being made, sterling silver and similar silver alloys were quickly singled out as being an ideal material for making flutes. Sterling silver's workability and the techniques used in its manufacturing were effectively a perfect match for the flute. And while it would tarnish build-up was slow, easily polished off, and a solid silver flute was highly repairable. This made them desirable, but also contributed to the already very high prices. As such, a cheaper material was desperately needed, and it was found in a metal called nickel silver. Nickel silver, also called German silver, isn't actually a silver at all. Rather, it's effectively a type of brass that's had nickel added to it to make it look more like sterling silver. Hence the name nickel silver. Compared to sterling silver, the color isn't quite an exact match. It's a bit of a pain to work with, and it tarnishes much more quickly. However, it's significantly cheaper and even a little more durable, making it a very suitable material for a beginner flute that needs to survive a few more bumps and go longer without a service. However, its main weakness, that increased tarnish rate, would later come back to haunt it. Imagine this: you've just walked into a flute shop, having spent months saving up money from your job to buy your first brand new shiny flute. The shop owner gleefully pulls out a couple different options for you to have a look at. When you ask the difference, the shop owner explains that the shiny one has been plated in real silver, the same material that professional flutes use. Figuring it must be the best, you pick the silver plated flute. Though little did you know that those two flutes were effectively identical, both being made from the same metal, nickel silver. That slightly tarnished model, that was just unplated nickel silver, showing off its main weakness, that increased tarnish rate. That tarnish rate was enough to inhibit sales. People noticed that their budget flutes just didn't hold their shine for long. And even at its best, nickel silver flutes just didn't look as nice as solid silver flutes. But manufacturers had a simple way of overcoming this: silver plating. Through silver plating, nickel silver could now be covered in a thin layer of real silver, meaning it now looked like silver and had the superior tarnish resistance of silver. And actually, because of a neat trick, the tarnish resistance could actually be even greater than a solid silver flute. Here we have an experiment set up. We have 3 keys, one of solid 950 silver, one of solid nickel silver, and one of silver plated nickel silver. And for good measure, we also have a ring made of sterling silver, the most popular professional flute material. All 3 keys in our ring have been sealed inside this box with our hard-boiled egg yolks. Hard-boiled egg yolks produce hydrogen sulfide, one of the main culprits for both silver and nickel silver tarnish. As such, we'll be able to observe just how quickly each metal tarnishes in an accelerated real-world test. The nickel silver developed visible tarnish almost instantly. Within less than a minute, the tarnish had grown quite significant, but then it slowed down and stopped. A few minutes later, these solid silvers were showing their first signs of tarnish, but they took half an hour to go fully black. Meanwhile, the silver plating kept going and going and going. By minute 45, it was only just starting to show its first signs of visible tarnish. To get a result at all, I even had to cover it directly in the egg. So nickel silver really does tarnish incredibly quickly. It's even quick enough that if a store didn't sell its flutes in time, it could end up being forced to sell tarnished flutes. Meanwhile, the silver plating put up a legendary performance, taking 60 times longer to develop noticeable tarnish than the nickel silver, and 20 times longer than even the solid silver key. That's right, silver plating outperformed solid silver. Believe it or not, this is actually the result we were expecting. Silver plating is made of pure silver, also called fine silver or 999 silver. By comparison, solid silver flutes have a small amount of copper added to it, 7.5% in the case of sterling silver flutes. Adding this copper dramatically increases the strength and durability of the metal, but also reduces its tarnish resistance. So even though budget flutes are made of fast tarnishing nickel silver, the fine silver plating acts as a protective barrier and tarnishes very, very slowly. This was the original intention, to make a strong, beautiful, affordable, tarnish-resistant flute material for the masses. And it really seemed like nickel silver, with a protective silver plating, was perfect for the job. But this is where our flaw comes in. Let's look back at our lightly tarnished key. See that? A small concentrated black dot. These are tarnish hotspots. But how could they happen? Well, we have our silver layer protecting our nickel silver. But what do you suppose would happen if a small hole was in that protective layer? You might think that there'd be a small dot of normally tarnishing nickel silver amongst an otherwise perfect silver surface, but actually it's worse than that. A lot worse. When a hole opens up in silver plating, sweat and oils from your skin are able to get into it. These oils and sweat contain a variety of salts, including some sulfides and chlorides, which dissolve in the slightly acidic water of your sweat to form ions. This simple little addition of some salty ionized sweat is the final ingredient required for a galvanic reaction, the same chemical reaction batteries use. Yep, your sweat has just effectively become battery acid, and with it, as soon as an opening that exposes the nickel silver is available, the silver plating starts rapidly stealing electrons from the nickel silver. This forces it to bond with the ions dissolved in your sweat, causing rapid accelerated tarnishing, far worse than nickel silver does by itself. As we saw before, nickel silver may tarnish very quickly, but once it has a thin layer of tarnish, that tarnish gets in the way and stops the rest of it tarnishing. Here though, the silver forces the nickel silver to keep on tarnishing anyway, and at a much faster rate than it otherwise would normally. In the case of our example with a hole-shaped flaw in the silver plating, a massive amount of tarnish builds up and concentrates on a single spot, creating a tall bump of tarnish. These spots are what we call pitting. In contrast, a wider area of plating failure, such as an area where the plating has been rubbed away, results in a wider area of tarnish. And I have some real-world examples to show you. Here you can see exactly what the addition of silver plating does in the long term. These two flutes are silver plated, and this third one is unplated nickel silver. We can see quite clearly that our first flute has suffered from small holes opening in its silver plating, causing pitting, whereas our second flute has suffered from wide areas of intense tarnish. Our third flute, however, whilst still clearly tarnished, is in a far better state. And while our silver-plated flutes are about 25 and 10 years old, flute number 3, with its bare unplated nickel silver, is over 60 years old, despite being in far better condition. And the state of these pitted, horribly tarnished flutes is the ultimate fate of every single silver-plated nickel silver flute, which is to say almost every single flute on the market. Remember that story I told you of walking into the flute shop and buying the shiny flute over the slightly tarnished one? That story is actually quite similar to the real experience of a friend of mine in the 80s, and a scenario that likely played out across the world over and over. Silver-plated flutes simply looked more beautiful when new and seemed to retain their beauty much longer than their nickel-silver counterparts. And on top of that, many players even believed that the silver plating could help the flute sound better. To buyers, it seemed like any company that didn't silver plate their flutes was simply cheaping out and not worth dealing with. And these days, it's hard to find a flute that isn't silver plated. In fact, the only non-silver plated flutes I could find by any reputable manufacturer are Gemeinhart's black nickel plated flutes and Trevor James's copper alloy flutes. Yet both of these still have silver plated nickel silver mechanisms, so they too will share the same fate. The only way that this reaction can truly be stopped is by stripping all of the silver plating off. But even that is a little bit risky, as if you miss even a small amount of silver, that can still keep the reaction going. But even though we can't stop our flutes from eventually meeting this fate, we can slow it down. But to figure out how to slow this reaction down, we first need to know what causes the silver plating to fail, which means destroying more flute keys in another expensive experiment. But that's okay, thanks to your support of PassionFlute. PassionFlute isn't just a YouTube channel. I'm a small flute maker creating handmade ceramic flutes. These are purpose-built for the people who genuinely want a flute that sounds and feels different, and for those who want to have fun with their playing. If you're that sort of person, consider having a look at the links in the description. And thank you so much for your support. It's what makes these videos possible and pays for these experiments. Speaking of which, let's get back to destroying flutes for science. Here we have a second experiment. In this one we have 5 silver-plated keys and 1 silver-plated foot joint. Each key has undergone some form of stress associated with damaging the plating. We have mechanical stress, chemical stress, a thermally stressed key, and a key that's been stressed from over-polishing. And we have a control key which is untouched. Our mechanically stressed key is here to simulate a flute which is frequently played, having been flexed very slightly over and over hundreds of times. Our chemically stressed key has been wrapped in a paper towel which was soaked in a solution of water, salt, and vinegar. This is to simulate a chemical attack from our salty, slightly acidic sweat. Our thermally stressed key has been heated up by a propane torch roughly to soldering temperature to simulate a repair being made. And our polished stress key has been stressed by repeated uses of a conventional silver polish, which you are not meant to use on silver-plated flutes. We've also done some extra experiments on our foot joint, dividing it into 4 sections to repeat our polish and sweat tests, as well as adding some extra mechanical tests in the form of simulating scratches with a butter knife, small dents with a steel hammer, and small bumps with a soft nylon hammer, which won't leave visible marks and simulates smaller, invisible hits. All of these keys and our foot joint were placed back inside the box with some fresh eggs and left for several hours to see the results. Alright, and here we have the results of our silver-plated keys test. These keys have actually been in here for quite a long time. I think we're at about 44 hours now. Yep, 44 hours and 10 minutes. So first up is our control key. This key is what we would expect everything to look like, assuming they had all been treated exactly the same, which they haven't. So any deviation from this we can expect to be a result of whatever we did to that specific key. We can see quite a bit of silver tarnish. We can also see some pitting, but most of what we're seeing is this sort of golden glow, rainbow patina, and black color. And we can definitely see some black tarnish on the bottom as well. So we're seeing what is mostly silver tarnish. That said, there is some pitting going on here as well, but only bits and pieces. It seems that most of what we've received here is, in fact, silver tarnish, which is what we would expect. After all, the plating is silver, so we would expect to only see silver tarnish since that's the only thing exposed to the air. Now, silver plating is rarely, if ever, perfect, which means that there would be spots where the nickel silver underneath can tarnish, which is what we are seeing based on there being some pitting. But the greater amount of silver tarnish overall means that the nickel silver has been relatively untouched in this case. Next up, we have our sweaty hands simulation. We can see, again, quite a bit of silver tarnish here. It's especially apparent wherever we have placed our salty sweat solution. I'm also seeing some pits. I do think I can see more pitting and more serious pits on this one. And the fact that the tarnish is very biased towards the side where the salt and vinegar solution was, is rather suspicious, as it means that that side is being attacked more, so therefore there is probably more nickel silver corrosion going on. That's just harder to see. And here is our silver polished key, and it is significantly more tarnished than anything else we can see here. We have more black, dark purple tarnish, we have more rainbow tarnish, and the entire key is just covered in it with no real evidence of silver anywhere. This key is by far the most tarnished, and goes to show you why they say to not use normal commercial silver polishes on your flute. And now we get to our first interesting result. This is the thermal stress test, and we can see that it is significantly less tarnished. But while being significantly less tarnished, there are a lot of pits. In fact, the pits were even more visible the previous times I'd checked this. We've actually started to develop more tarnish since then. But on the underside of the key we can see a lot more of these little dot-shaped hotspots of tarnish. This may look less severe, but it's actually probably more severe structurally because those pits dig deep and they create weak spots in the metal. So while visually this doesn't look as tarnished, it's actually probably worse. And here we have our final key, the mechanically stressed key. At a glance, this key actually looks to be outperforming all of the others quite significantly, but that's probably just a trick. After all of these keys have been exposed in the same conditions for the same amount of time. So the only reason why the silver plating on the outside has survived any better, the only logical reason, is that underneath the nickel silver is suffering, and that silver plating is just stealing electrons in order to preserve itself. And underneath we are seeing a lot of yellow colored tarnish. It's hard to say if this is silver plating tarnish or nickel silver tarnish coming in from underneath. Oh, I think I can also see what might be quite a lot of smaller pits forming around the key solder joint. Oh yes, and there's quite a bit on this piece of key here. So this, like thermal stress, appears to also be a type of stress which is degenerating on the inside rather than on the outside, which is arguably worse. And now we have a look at our foot joint. Our polished side is quite clearly a lot more tarnished than our control side. And on the salty sweat side, we can see quite clearly the parts where the solution was left behind. In fact, the bits around it appear to be less tarnished than our control side, which suggests that the presence of fingerprint or salty sweat will result in your flute being more severely tarnished where those fingerprints are and less so in the other areas, effectively concentrating that tarnish, which is more or less what we probably were expecting. Having a look at our mechanically stressed bit, we can see that the hammer blows of the steel hammer have turned a much darker color than the rest of the layer of tarnish on the outside of the foot joint. And quite interestingly, we can see that while the steel hammer blows are a lot darker than the surroundings, so are the nylon hammer blows. And that's significant, as those nylon hammer blows, I don't think I got footage of this before I did the test, but those nylon hammer blows were invisible before we did any of this tarnishing. So what that means is that while those smaller bumps that you subject your flute to, smaller hits that don't leave a dent, maybe just bumped it on something gently, those can still do a significant amount of damage to the silver plating, even if the material is not visibly damaged. Which means that this damage could go hidden. There is damage there, it's just invisible and only really crops up later. We can also see around the scratches that we're getting much more of that yellowy tarnish, which in my opinion looks more like the nickel silver tarnish from our control, so we're probably seeing more nickel silver tarnish in those spots. Another interesting note here is that we're seeing a lot of tarnish on our foot joint posts, and I find that rather fascinating as that tarnish looks a lot like the polished tarnish. You can see even on the control side and the polished side, now I did polish the posts a little bit, but even on the polished side and the control side, they're very, very similar in appearance. I wonder if that means that as your flute's sitting in its case, if those bits of the flute are being rubbed on more, say in its case as it jostles around, than other bits, and that effectively just polishes off the tips of these posts more than any other piece of the keywork on the flute. So, which stresses were the worst for the flute? Well, on the tarnish side, polishing with a typical consumer silver polish was devastating and the worst thing you could do to your flute, with leaving salty fingerprints coming in second. As for pitting, thermal stress, like a flute might experience during a serious repair, was terrible. After that, salty sweat was once again problem causing. So, what we've learnt is never polish your flute with anything other than its included polishing cloth, and always wipe off sweat and fingerprints after every single play. These two things are genuinely critical for the long life of any silver-plated flute. After that, seriously avoid any kind of damage that may be significant enough to cause a break, as the soldering required to fix such damage is very bad for the silver plating. Also, to reiterate, while tarnish is more ugly, pits are our biggest concern here. Tarnish is a cosmetic issue, but pits replace the solid metal of your flute's body and mechanism with deep spots of weak metal salts. That's like cutting a dip into a piece of paper, which would make a normally survivable bump suddenly very dangerous. As such, seriously, really do clean your flute after every single time you play it. The potential of salty sweat to create both tarnish and pits is a big long-term problem. And while thermal and mechanical stresses that your flute might experience during a repair are more significant for pits, accidents happen and sometimes repairs are necessary, but putting your flute away without polishing doesn't have those same excuses. That said, while there is bad news, there is also good news. All of the advice we've given here to protect your flute silver plating is standard flute care advice. So if you're already following all the classic flute care rules, you've already maximized the lifespan of your silver plating. The only other thing to be wary of is long-term storage. Every single time you store your flute for a long period, you give tarnish and pits the chance to form. So make sure you take it out to play every now and then, or better yet, use anti-tarnish strips. These will reduce the amount of sulfur in your case and therefore massively slow down how quickly tarnish and pits form, meaning that you can now store your flute safely for long periods. And if you haven't been doing these things, it isn't too late yet. While poor care will damage the silver plating, consistent good care will slow down the reaction enough that even a flute with damaged plating should still be able to keep looking good and not grow any tarnish or pits. At least so long as it's cared for well and not left in storage for too long. How long is too long is a bit hard to say. Our experiment, even though it only lasted 2 days, was probably equivalent to something around a couple of months to even several years of sitting in storage. It varies wildly depending on how much sulfur is in the local atmosphere, but I'd recommend just using anti-tarnish strips and following the directions they give you. But on the other hand, can we really expect silver-plated flutes to be perfectly cared for? These are the flutes that are sold to young beginners and most likely to receive abuse. And even if that wasn't true, good care ironically makes the silver plating fade even faster, meaning that the best case scenario is that the silver plating simply wears away. So why are we even putting it on to begin with? Base nickel silver will tarnish quickly, but without the plating, the tarnish doesn't develop very far. And compared to silver plating, solid nickel silver is far more repairable and much easier to polish without causing damage. So it feels like a change may be in order. One where we take a step back and start offering nickel silver flutes again, which last longer, are more durable, more repairable, and more affordable. But what do you think? Are you upset that manufacturers have been effectively self-sabotaging expensive instruments for decades? Or are you not that fazed by the tarnish and pitting problems that we saw today? Let me know in the comments.